Hey everyone, I am just going to give everyone a chance to log on, if that's okay. If you can hear me okay and everything's working and you can see my slide deck, would you just type a yes in the chat just to make sure that you can hear me all good? Would that be okay? Cool, okay, I'm being heard, amazing. Okay, so I'm going to get started and people can kind of join as they please. My name is Joe O'Brien. Firstly, delighted to be here. So thank you to the Compass Group for putting on the session and the opportunity to get to chat to people and look after their kind of mental and physical health. I'm delighted to be there. I'm a trainee health psychologist, and that means I'm completing my doctorate at the moment, and that is in the field of health psychology. That means I work a lot now with how kind of mental and physical health both interact and how we kind of manage the psychological factors that impact our physical health. Of course, stress is a big part of that. And today we'll kind of talk about how to just manage our days, manage our life a little bit differently in order to kind of get the most out of it. The way I like to work this is that if you have any questions, it would be best if you could just type them in the chat. I'm happy to take questions as I go. I'm happy if you just type in any questions that pop up for you throughout the session, simply because it's tough to remember something that you had a question about at the start and wait until the end. So I'm more than happy to take questions as I go, and it'll also save me talking into the abyss by saying any questions and then having a big blank space. But in terms of today, I guess what we're kind of going to be talking about is essentially about being busy and how we manage our time. We live in this world where we're constantly busy, right? Whether that's fueled by ourselves or our work or kind of any other factors. Most people have a life that's pretty busy. One thing I notice working a lot with people and speaking with people who are kind of struggling is that there's often this need to be busy, as if you're doing something wrong if you're not busy, or that you should be doing something differently, or you should be more busy. So there's this idea that we need to kind of fill every minute of every day, and by doing that, you get this badge of honor, and that sometimes gets in the way. Now, I'm not saying it's a bad thing to be busy, but there are certainly times when I'm sure that you'd prefer to be doing something else, or that you would prefer to be less busy in order to maybe get something else done. And again, what we're going to talk about a little bit is the things that kind of fill your life, the things that give you a sense of fulfillment and that sense of purpose. The thing that I guess I'm getting at here is that you can do some of those things, you can be busy, but also finding time for the things that give us purpose is maybe the important part, the part that actually looks after our mental well-being. So the idea of being busy is sometimes praised, right, by society, probably by our managers or our team as well. There's this pressure to always be switched on, always kind of flourishing and productive, and all those kind of buzzwords. Everyone wants to kind of be at their best and be super productive all the time. The thing at the moment, though, with COVID is that that changes things, right? There's a fantastic analogy for this by a psychologist called Kimberly Wilson, and when it comes to looking after your physical or mental health, she puts it like this. Imagine you're carrying a backpack on a long walk and the backpack's really heavy. So it's important to accommodate for that extra weight by taking more breaks and just giving yourself some sort of recovery time. You're giving yourself the best chance of going on the walk, right? The weight of the bag doesn't get any lighter. But what happens is you cut yourself a bit of slack to manage it, which means you can get to where you need to go. So you take more breaks. You take a water break, take time, or maybe take longer to get to where you want to go. If you're to carry on as you normally would, kind of as fast as possible with that heavy weight, you might not get to where you need to go. So you might kind of burn out if you don't accommodate for that extra weight. And that's the same with what's going on with the pandemic at the moment. The pandemic is the weight that we are all carrying on our shoulders. And that's important to recognize that things are different at the moment. They're not what they used to be. And holding ourselves to our standards of pre-COVID life isn't that helpful. We have to kind of adapt to this new way of managing, and that comes down to not pushing ourselves maybe as hard as before, or not expecting the same high standards, because all of our resources, all of our coping resources, all of the things that gave us some sort of fulfillment and looked after our mental health, they're not exactly readily available to us. And I think being good enough at the moment is just fine. So I don't expect you to answer this, as this kind of might be personal to you, but you're welcome to give any thoughts in the chat if you do have any. But I want you to consider, where's the line between you being busy and you being too busy? What's the point where it kind of tips over, where that kind of balance tips over there? So like, at what point are kind of the important things being compromised because of that maybe lack of balance? Most people say too busy is the primary reason that they can't do what they want to, just in their lives. So I think if you're going to take anything from this talk, assessing where your line is and how you know when things are too much is a really important step. Unless you kind of figure that out for yourself, I guess the rest of the information today won't add up to much, because that's the important part, right? Is recognizing when things are too much. This is an exercise that I would suggest we all do at some point. There are 168 hours in the week, and this kind of exercise time hunt can help us see where our time is going. So where does your time actually go? It's really interesting to try this for a week or so, jotting down just where you spend your time. And it's so often we find ourselves lost in work or social media or technology. And at the end of the week, we're wondering, oh, where did the time go? Or maybe at the start of the week, we're wondering, how will I fit in the time? I would genuinely try this out at least once. It's amazing to see where your time really goes. When you jot all of this down, consider the aspects of it that you would like more of and what you'd like less of. So I guess identifying the important pieces. Because the thing is with time is, it feels really short when we're doing things we love, but it can feel really long when we're doing things we hate. Typically, I guess from my experience working in a clinic, the things that are first to go when people get busy or when people get stressed or when people are struggling are often the things that are most needed to look after ourselves. So people start neglecting sleep, people start neglecting exercise, and maybe it's due to that kind of busy feeling that makes them not want to do it or not want to engage if they're struggling for kind of time because they've prioritized something else. So I think these aspects are important bits to consider when we're trying to look after ourselves, because I guess one really important saying to remember is, when we say yes to something, it means we're saying no to something else. So by choosing to give your time to something, you're also taking your time away from something else. And I guess adding up kind of on this time hunt thing that you're seeing on your screen, adding up, when you see your time going in one place, what am I taking my time away from? I guess a really big one for people at the moment is screen time and how long people spend on it. There's a great app. You can use it on an iPhone. There's also screen time apps like Moment that will kind of monitor your screen time and see where you kind of stand with that. I'd imagine if you're watching this, one of you at least will kind of struggle with the screen time aspect or technology in general. Another big problem is people have this idea that committing to something for an hour or two a week is this huge chunk of time. 1 hour is 0.5% of your entire week. So when you look at it like that, there's the opportunity there to look at the other 99.5% of your week and see if space can be made for something. I guess when I'm in clinic, I would regularly ask people, what's more important? Is it looking after your mental health, looking after your physical health, or is it the thing that you're doing instead of it? So people are like, well, I couldn't go for my walk, or I couldn't, exercise, or I couldn't call my friend because the housework had to be done. And yeah, the housework will need to be done at some stage, but what's more important? Looking after yourself and putting that boundary in place of what you really need to do, or keeping your house clean for that particular day. So just something to think about, certainly a good exercise to kind of gauge where your time is going. But what we actually tell ourselves in relation to time can actually tell you something. So if you consider how you speak about the things that you do, it might be telling you something. If you feel like you're always saying that you're wasting time or that you're always having to manage time, that might be a sign that maybe time is kind of this precious resource for you, and maybe you're not enjoying the things that you're speaking about. And again, consider how you experience different kind of activities in relation to your time. Think about how much it drags when you're kind of bored, and it flies when you're having fun. When something really bad happens, there's this feeling that it kind of lasts forever, right? So the bottom line here is, are all minutes created equal? And the answer is no. Things kind of slow down when we're experiencing distress or boredom. And again, if you have those feelings or thoughts like this is going really slow, what's that saying about your week? Maybe it's saying something is missing. And judging by the situation at the moment, we're all kind of missing a lot. Remember, you can ask any questions there in the chat function if you wish. But it's not all about numbers, right? I know I've focused a little bit on numbers. It's not all about that, and it's important not to entirely get caught up with that, right? It's more about doing things that are beneficial for us. For example, it's very often people will have mundane jobs, boring jobs that they don't actually like, but they love their life, right? And that's because some of them are kind of filling their lives with things that give them meaning and give them purpose, things that kind of allow them to be happy and look after themselves. The kind of analogy that I like to use is, if you think about having a bunch of empty cups, each cup is representative of your needs or your goals in life. Think of like sleep, relationships, connection, exercise, having purpose in your day or your life, hobbies, career, all of those different things that give people that kind of satisfaction. In order to kind of feel fulfilled and happy, and in order to kind of manage our own mental well-being, our own stress levels, we have to fill each cup, right? One or two isn't good enough. It's important to add something to each cup. Because as long as we have our cups filled with the things that we value in our life, we can lead happy, healthy lives. So that means that whether you work 4 hours a day or 10 hours a day, if you fill your cup with the right thing, you'll still have a happy, fulfilling life, right? And that's the important part here. Now, obviously working 10 hours a day makes it more difficult to make time for the other stuff. But it's less about, what I guess my point is, it's less about having 8 hours of everything and more important to actually focus on what we need. So that idea of having quality versus quantity. So it might not be helpful just to focus on how many hours we spend on a specific thing. If we get caught up in the idea that all parts of our lives have to have equal balance, we end up with this equation of 8 hours for work, 8 hours for non-work, 8 hours for sleep. But that's not that realistic, at least not in my experience. It's not realistic. It also ignores the difference in the quality of your time. So if you spent 8 hours at home doing absolutely nothing, would that be equal to 8 hours, meeting your closest friends or doing your favorite hobby or whatever? Probably not. I think in the research, they tend to kind of try and break them down into this very even work and non-work, but it's important to recognize the different domains of your life as having different levels of meaning and different levels of quality. Does that make sense? Any kind of questions so far? If you have any, you're more than welcome to use the chat. So when we talk about containers of meaning, think about, would you rather, the way I pitch this question isn't actually the one on the screen. I would always say, would you rather 2 hours with friends and family or 30 minutes with friends and family? And I would follow that up with, it depends who your family and friends are, right? Because sometimes 2 hours with family and friends could be torture versus 30 minutes. So even an example, like if you're a morning person, 15 minutes in bed might be worth a lot more to you than kind of 15 minutes added on to your lunch break or watching Netflix. So if we go purely by numbers, it's not necessarily correct. It's not necessarily accurate. So instead of trying to make those numbers match up, consider the significance that you assign to the time you spend in different activities. So it might be helpful to think about time not so much as a number, which is always kind of counting down, but rather a series of containers of meaning. So each kind of opportunity to do something with your time is a chance to do something that will either engage you in a meaningful way or, make you happy, reduce your stress levels, just look after your basic needs. And with that, it's kind of important to identify what is it that's important. So what makes you enthusiastic about life? And I basically want you to kind of reflect on what you find yourself doing with your time. So when things get kind of busy or things get hectic, we obviously feel stressed. When we feel stressed, we might get avoidant. And when I say get avoidant, I mean that we kind of tend to avoid things when we're stressed, when we are emotional, when we're finding things hard, which I think is common for everyone at the moment. We tend to kind of lose track of what we want or what we need. And we kind of become orientated in terms of what we want to avoid. So we kind of cut things out rather than including things. So I want you guys to think about when things get stressful or busy for you, what are the first things that you avoid? Like, do you pull out of the phone call with your friend? Do you compromise your sleep? I know that that's a pretty significant one, is compromising your sleep. People often say, you know, oh, I'll stay up late to get that done, or I didn't get enough me time, so I'll stay up late, or I'll get up early to make sure I get a head start on whatever I'm doing. The problem with that is that sleep is like a core fundamental. It underpins our stress response. It underpins our immune system. It underpins so many different aspects of our health. So when we get compromised sleep, our stress hormones when we wake up are actually higher. So our stress response is automatically triggered by getting a lack of sleep. Yet when things get hard, people tend to compromise their sleep. Do you start kind of avoiding other self-care activities that keep us mentally healthy? So that is maybe the phone calls with a friend. Eating well is a big one, the exercise part. So I guess I just want to get you thinking. If this session does nothing else but get you thinking, I'd be happy. How much time do you spend kind of moving towards something or including something or looking forward to something even versus trying to get away from something, trying to kind of cut out things because you're too busy or you can't kind of manage? And this kind of ties into what I spoke about already with regards to identifying when things aren't right for you. So how to identify when things actually need to change. That might be that you realize you're more focused on trying to avoid lots of different things rather than trying to include the fulfilling pieces in your life. Now, what I talk about a lot, I guess when I talk in clinic, is about our values. How can we kind of find or get in touch with our values? Now, it's very difficult to remain engaged with all of your values all of the time. It's not really practical to base every decision we make off this really deep search for meaning and value. But it is important to kind of get in touch with those values from time to time. And when I say your values, what I mean is what aspects of life are important to you? And are you doing enough in your life at the moment with those values? Because essentially they're the things that bring us happiness, right? They're the things that will moderate our stress levels in the end. They're the things that will, even if we do work the 8-hour day or the 10-hour day, they're the things that will mediate the stress response. So if you do have a hard day, if you're still filling your life with all of those valuable things that you value, that stress response will be reduced. Your ability to manage that will even be reduced. So when we say kind of, when we say something is kind of pointless, maybe when we say something doesn't matter, it doesn't, we kind of, I guess it means we don't understand necessarily that it's not doing anything for us versus something that is valuable, right? It contributes something to our lives. The alternative to this is like, how often do you engage in behaviors that don't move you towards who you want to be? Or kind of, are you doing things in your life that are actually against your values or make you feel uncomfortable? Because typically they would kind of add more to that stress response. The example that I often give is imagine so if someone's profession was a butcher, but they were a vegetarian, right? That's going to create a lot more conflict for that person and maybe be more stressful. So living life in line with your goals is going to be beneficial for your mental health. It's going to be beneficial for just managing yourself. But also, if you're engaging in a lot of things that aren't who you are, it can make things difficult too. The next part is a little bit about neuropsychology. So that is the study of specific processes and behaviors that kind of relate to the brain. So basically neuropsychology aims to provide an understanding, a very biological understanding about how we remember things, how we make decisions, how we problem solve, and how we pay attention. Now, I guess from my experience and from speaking to a lot of people about how they're kind of managing, there's this kind of common theme that comes up, and it's like people at the moment seem to be working longer hours, but also seem to be less productive, getting less done, but working longer hours and kind of struggling to manage that. A central part of neuropsychology is executive functioning. And that is basically a wide variety of processes. It's essentially one of the most important things about our kind of brain function, right? One of the parts that comes into it is switching attention from task to task. So switching between things can be, I guess, more difficult for some people than others. If you think about your day, right, and think about getting the most from your day, right? How often do you switch activities, and how much time is eaten up by those switches? People often think they're really good at multitasking. Unfortunately, let me tell you that it's very unlikely that you're good at multitasking. Humans aren't good at multitasking. So I guess a really good example would be if anyone's ever tried to text and drive. Texting is a simple activity, right? Driving, when you kind of get the hang of it, is a simple activity. Put two simple activities together and it's very difficult, right? You're maybe looking at your phone, next thing you're hitting the cat's eyes on the side of the road. It's not a good time. People are generally poor at multitasking, and switching between tasks can take up a lot of time. So you might feel that you are kind of working yourself to the bone, or like putting in really hard hours and getting nothing done. And so often that's due to repeated switching of tasks and the effort and time it takes to reorient yourself to a new task. So it takes time to switch between those things. Think about when you're kind of in the zone with one piece of work and then an email notification pops up, or you get a phone call, or you just check your phone, right? All of those things take away your attention, and it takes time to reorientate. So just, I guess, review or be aware that when you engage with tasks, when things take your attention away, it essentially it's not as productive, right? It's wasting some sort of time. And I guess the best thing you can kind of focus on is batching tasks or single tasking. So like doing all your emails in one go, or setting yourself a time to do something and putting your phone away, putting everything else away, and only focusing on one thing at a time. Because no matter how good we feel we are at multitasking, people are generally quite poor at it. If switching tasks is on this end of the spectrum, think about the opposite end of the spectrum, which is staying on one thing until you're absolutely exhausted. Switches are important, but it's all about reflecting on what is actually the most helpful. And the concept of being on autopilot is one that comes up quite a lot. Autopilot's not necessarily good or bad, but at times it can be really helpful. What I would say is that use your switches wisely. I think if you are someone who is having email notifications pop up frequently every kind of hour, like that's probably unhelpful. Whereas if you can spend between an hour and 90 minutes on one single task, it's going to be more beneficial. And I'm going to speak about why that is in a second. Sorry, before I move on from that, it says at the bottom, how can we improve executive function? Believe it or not, one of the best ways to improve executive function is actually sleep. Again, sleep can be the first thing to go. It's the first thing that's compromised sometimes when we get stressed, or when we're emotional, or just difficult things are going on. I know I actually run a sleep clinic, and people are really struggling with their sleep at the moment. Their sleep has significantly changed since lockdown and those different parts. I've had reports of like lots of strange, unusual dreams. People are dreaming a lot more by the sense of it. But working on your sleep and focusing on your sleep actually improves your executive function. Like I said, sleep kind of underpins a lot of different health systems, and the brain is one of them. So if you're looking to work on and be at your best, focusing on your sleep is going to be a big part of that. So I'm not sure how many of you have heard of circadian rhythms. They're essentially our internal body clock, and people have this idea that they go up and down during sleep, right? Circadian rhythms actually work all the way throughout the day in these kind of 90 to 110 minute cycles. Attention can kind of go up to a 90-minute period. It goes anywhere from kind of 30 or 40 minutes to all the way to 90. So there's a very biological reason for our ability to focus. Even that kind of afternoon slump is actually a natural dip in our circadian rhythm. That's not something that is, unique to you or to anyone else. That afternoon slump is kind of ingrained in our biology, which is really interesting. So our body works on these kind of circadian rhythms. They occur throughout the day. 24 hours a day. I guess the most thoroughly researched example is sleep. A sleep cycle takes about 90 minutes, and that is essentially allowing you to move through all the stages. But while you're awake, the level of alertness also goes through those cycles. So what I mean by being smart with your time is that if you're single tasking, remember that, generally you will hit a natural dip after 90 minutes or every kind of 90 minutes. I think that's really important to consider, because if you take your breaks at the right times, if you kind of pay attention to when you are alert versus when you're not, you're going to get the best out of your day and hopefully prevent some people working the longer hours and not getting as much done. I'd also recommend putting in your own structure. So we're in a situation where pre-lockdown and pre-COVID, we always had a set structure, and that set structure was set for us by our work, by our jobs, by our lifestyle. We had generally a set start time and a set finish time. There was an acceptable time to go for lunch, and we kind of took that for granted because we never had to pay attention to it. Unfortunately, when people are working from home, that's up to us now to do. And because we've never thought of it, maybe some of you haven't thought of putting it in place for yourself. And that's important for work boundaries, because when you go, when you're working longer hours and doing less work, it doesn't feel so good, right? And when you're saying yes to doing more work, so when you go over your standard work finish time, remember that you're saying no to something else. And the thing that you're saying no to might be the thing that's going to look after your mental health, look after kind of your stress levels and all of that. Now, there is kind of variability between people in terms of their circadian rhythms, but there is that idea that 90 minutes is generally the max when that rhythm dies. Anywhere from 40 to 90 really in terms of like peak alertness, but something to kind of, I guess, consider. So when I say that single tasking thing, what I would suggest is kind of setting a timer for that amount of time and stick with a single task. So that means no disruptions. That means no notifications on email, phone, on voicemail, like alerting your team or your manager or whoever that you're going to be available after that period or whatever that looks like for you. And, put yourself in a position where you can actually focus on one thing. Because look, I've noticed myself, and I work with a lot of people who are struggling at the moment. It's something that people aren't paying attention to, but you would be surprised how having those workplace boundaries in terms of taking your lunch, in terms of finishing at the time you're supposed to finish at, in terms of, limiting or doing your best to limit those distractions, you'd be surprised how effective that is. So I would suggest kind of trying out the 90-minute timer maximum, seeing kind of how long you last or what's most effective for you, and getting stuck in and I guess monitoring those kind of patterns. It also says here about recognizing what kind of physical cues can tell you. Do you need to move around more or do you not? If you are including kind of an hour a day of some sort of movement or outdoor activity, you should be okay in terms of fidgeting and stuff like that. Hunger though, meal frequency is important. As a health psychologist, I work a lot in nutrition, and eating frequently throughout the day is important. So kind of no more than 4 hours, I would imagine, even if that's kind of 4 hours between a snack and a main meal. I think arguably the most important part, but these kind of health behaviors are important for managing stress, right? Going back to the executive function piece, the bit that helps us self-regulate, make decisions, switch tasks, pay attention, all of those different parts can lead to, some of these lifestyle factors can lead to those executive functions being depleted. Sorry, I just got a question there, and I said I'd answer these questions as they come up. Is there a best time for sleep and wake up, or does this depend on every individual? So it depends on the individual. We have a thing called sleep chronotypes, and that is your genetic predisposition for waking up late or early. There are lots of kind of, sleep myths or like old school tips that, the hours before 12 and are worth double, and, that everyone should get up at, people talk about like getting up at 4 and 5 a.m. There is no single time that is best to wake up once you're getting between 7 and 9 hours. People often say to me, oh yeah, I'm tired, but I get my 7 hours, without realizing that adults need up to 9 hours. So there isn't a best time to wake up and go to sleep. One thing is be consistent. Whatever time you are waking up at and going to sleep at, make sure it's between 7 and 9 hours of sleep, and also that it's the same time each night if you can. So I hope that answers your question. It is kind of variable. Where was I? Okay, the executive functions, yeah. So I guess when we feel stressed, when we feel like emotional, when a lot is going on, we often withdraw from these parts, okay? And managing our stress is partly related to what we do. So it's not just about how we think or how resilient we are, or our genetics. There are things that we can do to actually manage our stress levels. When the stress response kicks in, things like adrenaline shoot up, things like cortisol shoot up. They're kind of hormones produced in the body that are a good measure of stress. And what I said about sleep earlier in terms of it being vital, anything less than 7 hours tends to have a spike in your cortisol levels. So basically, if you get less than 7 hours sleep, automatically before you start the day, your baseline stress level is higher. So it heightens those stress hormones. The second part is exercise. Often when we struggle with our stress and we feel overwhelmed, again, we don't find the time to do these things. Exercise is a great way of managing stress hormones. It actually builds mental resilience. And what I mean by that is, obviously when you run, you're building physically, you're kind of building something, right? If you go to the gym, you're building muscle. If you go for a run, you're building your lung capacity. But exercise actually builds mental resilience. So what they found is that people who exercise, their stress response goes back to normal and quicker when you exercise. So it's a very physiological, biological response to stress. When you exercise, that stress response settles back down far quicker than if you don't. Diet is a big one that maybe sometimes people kind of neglect. Obviously, if you eat poorly, you're not going to feel great. You might maybe be stress eating itself, like turn to food in response to stress. What I would say about diet is it's similar to, people often think, you eat protein for your muscles or you eat carbohydrates for energy. Our brain is fueled by the same nutrients. And the example, I was actually speaking about burnout earlier today, and the example I gave was, if you do a marathon and all you've eaten for the previous 2 weeks were Haribo, you're not going to perform to your best, right? Similarly, if you're nutrient deficient, your brain's not going to respond or perform as well as it should. And the brain is responsible for managing stress, managing emotions, being resilient. So if you're not eating well, you're not fueling your brain to function properly, and that can impact on stress management. Connectedness is one we're all kind of missing at the moment. People often have this maybe defeatist attitude that, oh, well, I can't do anything, so I'll do nothing. Although online connection, Zoom calls, phone calls aren't the same as hanging out with your friends or talking to your family, it's about doing what we can at the moment. So in the absence of being able to hang out with people and be close to people and have that level of connection that we'd all like, what can you do with that at the moment? So can you kind of reach out to somebody, or can you speak about it over the phone in the absence of being able to do that? And it's something that we're all missing. The level of kind of isolation and loneliness has skyrocketed. We've seen an increase in that significantly in our clinics. But I would say kind of do what you can, because that is, again, a fundamental of human health. People who have positive relationships and close connections versus people who don't live about 15 to 20 years longer. So if you have good connections and you're looking after yourself and you're looking after your relationships, that's actually a health behavior, and it kind of ties over to your health. So I think that's an important thing to consider. And then mindfulness, look, it's not for everyone. It supports about 50% of people who try mindfulness. Some people are naturally mindful, so again, they may not kind of respond well to actively practicing it. But mindfulness can support or help with moderating stress and kind of managing a little bit better. So just to summarize, the start was all about how busy we are and identifying how we are, what we do with time. Doing that time exercise, I guess, is really valuable if you're someone who feels like a little bit overwhelmed or a little bit like you can't find the time for things. Go on that time hunt and see where your time is going, because I think that's an important step. Is there time there, or maybe it's going somewhere you don't want it to go? It's not all about numbers. So the kind of, I guess, the amount of quality is important, not just the quantity. It's not just about, getting a certain amount of hours in. It's about living life in line with your values. And if you do that, you're giving yourself the best chance of managing. I guess if all of us reflect on what's actually going on at the moment and what we're missing, it's very likely that we'll have something that we can kind of improve on to look after ourselves. Looking at how much we are avoiding, so how much we're cutting out versus how much we're actually working towards. We spoke about circadian rhythms and the idea of single tasking, that kind of 90-minute cycle, and a little bit about how to work smarter. I really hope that was helpful. In terms of, I guess, one way of doing this that might be most helpful is asking you, is there, like, you all attended this webinar for a reason. I would hope that you got something from it, but if you attended with the intention or with kind of an idea in your head about what you wanted to get from it, ask those questions now. So maybe you came being like having a specific issue or something that in particular you'd love to know what to manage or how to manage it. Maybe there's a specific thing that you're missing at the moment or a specific thing you wanted to ask about. Maybe it wasn't covered. If that is the case, please just ask a question about it. You can use the Q&A or the chat. Because I have a few minutes left, I find it works best if you get your questions answered. So if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Otherwise, that is all from me. I will stay here just in case there are any questions that flood in. There's none at the moment. But I really appreciate your time. And yeah, again, thanks to the Compass Group for having me. And yeah, I appreciate all of you attending. Maeve, I actually answered that one earlier on in the midst of one of those rants that I was on. So we did cover if sleep, or if there was a type of sleep, that kind of sleep cycle that worked. With the situation being as it is there any way we can do to boost general motivation levels? Motivation to kind of, I guess, engage in your work. What I find is that when things drag out a little bit, like they are at the moment, when you try and stick to one thing for the whole day and you end up sitting there getting nothing done, that can just be wildly unhelpful. What I find is that even if it is about, maybe you're contracted for 8 hours and you're finding the 8-hour day really long, breaking it up into smaller, kind of more bite-sized parts, as well as that kind of looking after your own well-being in the whole context of your work, can be helpful. And then there's also the idea of like accountability and being seen. It can be very difficult to motivate yourself, especially if maybe you don't love your job or your job isn't, your favorite thing ever. It can be very difficult to kind of motivate yourself in that regard. So reaching out to a teammate or a colleague and telling them what you're working on, getting or reaching out to a manager or other to like look over your work or talk to them about your work can be really helpful, even if it's just a catch-up call for 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the day. So possibly the accountability part. But I guess there's also the part about maybe going easy on yourself at the moment is going to be more beneficial for your mental health, because everyone's holding themselves to these pre-COVID standards. So maybe they used to get 10 out of 10 work done every day, and now it's 7 out of 10, and they are a bit hard on themselves because motivation is lacking and they're not able to get what they used to do done. What I would say in that regard is that's common across the board. That's because, like I said at the start, the example that I gave about carrying the bag with extra weight, it's very difficult to just go about it as we've always done. It's very difficult to go about it as if nothing's changed, but everything has changed. And a lot of our things that would support us and give us motivation are taken away. So I think it's important to also consider that part of it, that we're not necessarily exactly where we used to be, and not to maybe hold ourselves to that standard. Any other